The knock on Eleanor Whitmore's door came just before sunrise, and she knew before it opened that her life had already been decided without her. "Get dressed," her father said, standing in the doorway with a rolled parchment clutched in his hand. "You are leaving within the hour." Eleanor sat up in bed, her heart pounding. "Leaving for where, father?" Lord Edgar Whitmore did not meet her eyes. He looked instead at the wall behind her, as though it were easier to speak to stone than to his own daughter. "The capital. You have been chosen to join the court of Emperor Julian." The name alone was enough to steal the breath from her lungs. Emperor Julian Ashgrave, the Dragon Emperor, the man whose bloodline was said to carry fire in its veins, who ruled from a palace of black stone and gold, who was rumored to have burned an entire rebel fleet with nothing but his own breath. Children in her province were warned to behave, or the Dragon Emperor would hear of it. "Chosen," Eleanor repeated slowly. "Chosen by whom?" "By me." Her father finally looked at her, and there was no apology in his face, only the hard calculation of a man who had run out of other options. "I have offered your hand to bear him an heir. The imperial messengers arrived 3 days ago. I have already accepted on your behalf." Eleanor felt the room tilt around her. 3 days. He had known for 3 days and said nothing, while she went about her ordinary life, tending the garden, mending linens, believing her future still belonged to her. "You cannot do this," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she understood how little they mattered. Her father was a lord in name only now, his lands mortgaged twice over, his debts whispered about in every trading post from here to the eastern hills. An alliance with the throne, even one built on his daughter's body, was the only rope left to pull him out of ruin. "I have already done it," he said. "The carriage is waiting. Pack only what you need." He left before she could argue further, the door closing with a soft, final click that echoed louder than any slammed door ever could. Eleanor sat alone in the gray light of morning, her hands trembling in her lap. She thought of the years since her illness, the fever that had swept through the province when she was 12, the weeks she had spent burning and shivering while the village healer, an old woman named Agnes, pressed cool cloths to her forehead and prayed over her. Eleanor had survived. Most children who caught that fever did not, but the healer had told her mother quietly, in words Eleanor was never meant to hear, that the illness had scarred something deep inside her, something that meant she would never carry a child of her own. Her mother had wept. Her father, at the time, had barely reacted at all, too consumed by his ledgers and his debts to think much of a daughter's fertility. That had been 6 years ago. Eleanor had grown into a woman since then, quiet and watchful, carrying her secret the way some people carry an old wound, tender but hidden, something she touched only when she was alone. Now that secret was about to be sent, unknowing, into the bed of the most powerful man in the empire, a man who wanted nothing from her except the one thing she could never give him. She dressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with the laces of her traveling dress. Through the small window of her room, she could see the carriage already waiting in the courtyard, its black wood polished to a mirror shine, drawn by 2 horses so pale they looked almost silver. Imperial guards stood at attention beside it, their armor catching the first light of the sun. This was not a request. It never had been. When she stepped outside, her father was waiting near the carriage door, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might say something kind, some small word of comfort before she left. Instead, he said only, "Do not embarrass this family. Whatever happens in that palace, remember what your silence is worth to us." Eleanor understood then, with a clarity that felt like cold water down her spine, exactly what he meant. He knew. Somewhere in his calculations, in the years since the healer's warning, he had not forgotten. He was gambling on her secret staying buried long enough for the family to reap whatever benefits came from the arrangement, regardless of what happened to her once the truth surfaced, if it ever did. She did not answer him. She climbed into the carriage without a word, and when the door shut behind her, she felt something inside her close as well, some door she would not open again in front of him. The journey to the capital took 4 days. Eleanor spent most of it staring out the small carriage window, watching her father's lands give way to unfamiliar hills, then to wide rivers crossed by stone bridges, then finally to the outer walls of the capital city itself, walls so tall they seemed to swallow the sky. She had never traveled this far from home. She had never seen a city this large, filled with more people in one street than lived in her entire province. At the center of it all rose the imperial palace, a structure of black stone veined with gold, its roofline curved like the spine of some enormous sleeping creature. Eleanor had heard the stories her whole life, that the first emperor of the Ashgrave line had been part dragon himself, that the blood ran thinner now but had never fully disappeared, that Emperor Julian's eyes sometimes caught the light in a way no ordinary man's eyes should. She had always assumed these were just stories, the kind parents told to keep children obedient. Now, staring up at the palace that would be her new home, she was no longer so certain. The carriage passed through 3 separate gates before it finally stopped in an inner courtyard, and Eleanor was escorted out by a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper voice, who introduced herself only as Mistress Odile, keeper of the women's quarters. "You will bathe, you will be dressed properly, and you will learn the rules of this palace before you are presented to His Majesty," Odile said, walking briskly ahead of Eleanor through a maze of corridors. "There are 17 women currently residing in the consort wing. You are the 18th. Do not expect friendship from any of them. Expect competition." Eleanor said nothing, absorbing every word as though it might save her life later. Perhaps it would. The consort wing was more beautiful than anything Eleanor had ever seen, with silk screens dyed the color of sunset, floors polished so smooth they reflected the lantern light, gardens visible through every window, filled with flowers she could not name. But the beauty did not comfort her. It felt instead like a cage built by someone with excellent taste, still a cage all the same. She was given a small chamber near the end of the wing, plain compared to the others she glimpsed on the way, likely a reflection of her family's modest status compared to the daughters of dukes and generals who filled the grander rooms. She did not mind. A smaller room meant fewer eyes on her, and right now, invisibility felt like the safest thing she owned. That evening, as she sat alone trying to steady her nerves, a servant arrived with a message. His Majesty would receive her the following morning. Eleanor barely slept that night, running through every possible version of what she might say, what she might do, how long her secret might survive contact with a man whose entire purpose in choosing her was the one thing she could not provide. Morning came too quickly. She was dressed in deep red robes, her hair pinned with gold combs that felt heavier than they looked, and led through a series of increasingly grand hallways until she reached a set of towering doors carved with the images of coiling dragons. The doors opened without anyone visibly touching them, and Eleanor stepped into the throne room with her chin lifted, determined not to let her fear show on her face, whatever it cost her. The throne room was vast, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow far above, its walls lined with braziers that burned with flames tinted faintly gold. And at the far end, seated upon a throne carved from black stone, was Emperor Julian Ashgrave. He was younger than she expected, perhaps only a handful of years older than she was herself, though there was nothing youthful in the way he watched her approach. His eyes, dark as the throne beneath him, tracked her every step with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He did not rise. He did not smile. He simply watched, as though weighing her worth with a single glance. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, his voice low and even, carrying easily across the enormous room without effort. "Daughter of Lord Edgar Whitmore, offered to my court as a candidate to bear the imperial heir." "Yes, Your Majesty," Eleanor said, bowing low, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Look at me," he said. She lifted her head, meeting his eyes despite every instinct urging her to keep them lowered. Whatever she had expected, cruelty, indifference, boredom, she found none of it in his expression. Instead, she found something far more unsettling. Genuine curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he had not yet decided whether he wanted to solve. "Your father is deeply in debt," Julian said, not unkindly, but without softness either. "He has offered you as though you were a debt payment rather than a daughter. Tell me, Eleanor Whitmore, do you resent him for it?" The question caught her completely off guard. No one in her life had ever asked her opinion on anything that mattered, least of all an emperor she had known for less than a minute. She hesitated, unsure what answer would be safest, before deciding that honesty, at least in this moment, might serve her better than practiced diplomacy. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "I do." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the hard lines of his face. "Good," he said. "I have little patience for women who pretend contentment they do not feel. You may rise." Eleanor stood, still trembling slightly, though whether from fear or something else entirely, she could not say. Julian rose from his throne and descended the steps toward her, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that made her acutely aware of how small she felt beside him. "You will remain in the consort wing," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I make no promises about what will come of your presence here. I have learned that promises made too quickly are rarely kept. But I will say this: I did not ask for a woman who offers me silence and obedience alone. If you have thoughts, Eleanor Whitmore, I expect to hear them. And if my thoughts displease you, Your Majesty..." For the first time, something that might genuinely have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Then I will tell you so, and we will continue regardless. Now go. Mistress Odile will explain the rest." Eleanor bowed again and turned to leave, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She had expected cruelty, or at the very least, cold indifference. She had not expected a man who seemed almost as trapped by his circumstances as she was by hers. A ruler surrounded by women, offered up like tribute, searching for something more than blind obedience in return. As she walked back through the long corridors toward the consort wing, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since her father's knock at dawn, a single steadying breath. The danger was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. Her secret still waited, buried and fragile, ready to shatter everything the moment it was discovered. But for now, in this strange palace of black stone and golden fire, she had survived her first encounter with the Dragon Emperor. It would not be her last. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor had not expected to find inside a palace built around fear and ambition. Mornings began with lessons from Mistress Odile, who drilled her on court etiquette with the patience of a woman who had trained 18 consorts and expected to train 18 more before her own retirement. Afternoons were spent in the gardens, where Eleanor learned quickly that beauty and danger often shared the same soil. The other consorts noticed her almost immediately, though not with the warmth she once, foolishly, hoped for. Word had spread fast through the wing that the Emperor had spoken with the new arrival for nearly 10 minutes, an eternity by the standards of these women, most of whom received only a passing nod during their first audience. 10 minutes was enough to make Eleanor a target. "You must be the debt payment," said a woman with sleek dark hair and eyes like polished onyx, the first time they crossed paths near the koi pond. Her name, Eleanor would soon learn, was Isabel, daughter of a wealthy merchant family that had spent generations trying to buy their way into nobility. "I heard your father owes more gold than your entire province produces in a year." "News travels quickly here," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even. "Everything travels quickly here," Isabel replied, studying her with open calculation. "Especially failure. I give you 3 months before His Majesty tires of novelty and sends you back to whatever debt-ridden estate you crawled out of." Eleanor said nothing, only inclined her head politely and continued walking, refusing to give Isabel the satisfaction of a response. She had learned long ago that arguing with cruelty rarely extinguished it, and she suspected Isabel thrived on exactly that kind of confrontation. Not every consort was hostile. A quieter woman named Charlotte, gentle-voiced and several years older than the rest, took an interest in Eleanor that seemed genuine rather than strategic. They met properly during a shared lesson on imperial history, where Charlotte leaned close and whispered, "Ignore Isabel. She has been here 2 years and still has no child, and no favor from His Majesty. Bitterness makes people cruel faster than anything else." 2 years? Eleanor repeated, surprised. And nothing has come of it? Charlotte shook her head slightly. His Majesty is careful. Some say too careful. He does not simply choose a woman and expect a child by the season's end, the way emperors before him did. He watches. He waits. Some of the older consorts believe he is searching for something beyond an heir, though none of us can say what. Eleanor filed that piece of information away carefully. If Julian truly was searching for something beyond a simple heir, perhaps her secret would matter less than she feared. Or perhaps, she reminded herself grimly, it would matter more, once he realized exactly how far short of expectation she fell. Her second audience with the Emperor came nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, and this time it was not held in the grand throne room, but in a smaller study lined with scrolls and maps, a space that felt almost startlingly ordinary compared to the palace's usual grandeur. Julian sat behind a wide desk, a brush still wet with ink resting near his hand, and gestured for her to sit across from him without ceremony. "You have been here 2 weeks," he said, not looking up immediately from the document he was reviewing. "Tell me what you think of my palace." Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "It is beautiful, Your Majesty, and lonelier than I expected a place full of people to be." That earned her his full attention. He set down his brush and studied her with the same unsettling intensity she remembered from their first meeting. "Explain." "Everyone here watches everyone else," Eleanor said. "The consorts watch each other for weakness. The servants watch the consorts for gossip. I imagine the advisors watch you the same way, waiting to see which direction you will lean before they commit to an opinion of their own. It seems a very difficult place to trust anyone." Julian leaned back in his chair, a faint furrow forming between his brows, though it seemed thoughtful rather than displeased. "You are more observant than most who arrive here." "I have very little else to occupy my time, Your Majesty, aside from observing." A short, surprised laugh escaped him, quickly suppressed, as though laughter were a habit he had trained himself out of long ago. "Tell me about your home, your real home, before the carriage and the guards and my father's old throne room." Eleanor hesitated. No one had asked her that either. She spoke slowly at first, then with increasing ease, describing the small province where she had grown up, the orchard behind her family's estate, the way the hills turned gold in late summer before the harvest. She did not mention her illness. She did not mention the healer, Agnes, or the words that had been spoken over her sickbed 6 years earlier. She kept that part of herself locked away, the way she had learned to do since the moment her father revealed his plan. Julian listened without interrupting, and something in his posture softened as she spoke, the rigid formality of the Emperor giving way, briefly, to something closer to simple attentiveness. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "My father built this palace to remind everyone who looked at it that our bloodline was something other than ordinary," he said. "He believed our strength lay in being feared. I have never fully agreed with him, though I have inherited his throne, and much of his fear, whether I wanted it or not." "Do you want an heir who is feared, Your Majesty?" Eleanor asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Julian's dark eyes settled on her, unreadable for a moment before something almost gentle crossed his expression. "I want an heir who is not alone the way I have been," he said quietly. "Fear is easy to inherit. Company is not." Eleanor's chest tightened at the honesty in his voice, an honesty that felt entirely unguarded, unlike anything she expected from a man raised to rule an empire through strength and intimidation. She thought again of her secret, hidden and waiting, and for the first time she felt something sharper than fear settle over her, something closer to grief for a future she was beginning, despite every warning to herself to want. Their meetings became more frequent after that, though never predictable enough for the other consorts to fully track. Sometimes Julian summoned her to his study to discuss matters of the provinces, testing her opinions on trade routes and harvest taxes with a seriousness that surprised her. Sometimes he simply asked her to walk with him through the gardens in the cooler hours of the evening, saying little, seeming content only with the silence of her company. Isabel's hostility sharpened with every visible sign of favor. She began appearing wherever Eleanor walked, offering comments dressed as pleasantries, but sharpened at the edges like knives. "His Majesty enjoys novelty," Isabel said one afternoon, falling into step beside Eleanor near the training grounds where several of the palace guards practiced with wooden swords. "He enjoyed my company greatly, once, before he grew bored. You will learn, as I did, that his attention is a river, not a lake. It moves. It does not stay. Perhaps," Eleanor said calmly, "or perhaps it simply hasn't found what it was searching for until now." She regretted the words the moment they left her mouth, watching Isabel's expression flicker from smugness to something colder and far more dangerous. She had made an enemy with that single sentence, she realized, one who would not forget the insult easily. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor slipped out into the garden alone, drawn by the cool night air and the need to escape the tightening walls of her own thoughts. She found Julian there as well, standing near the koi pond, his figure lit faintly by lantern light and the pale glow of the moon. "You are awake late," he observed, without turning. "So are you, Your Majesty." He glanced at her, something almost wry in his expression. Sleep does not come easily to men who spend their days pretending certainty they do not feel. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, watching the fish drift lazily beneath the water's surface. "What are you uncertain about, if I may ask?" Julian was quiet for a long moment. "Whether the woman standing beside me tonight sees me, or merely sees the throne behind me," he said finally. "It is a question I have asked of every consort who has come through these halls, and I have never once received an answer I fully believed." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something far more dangerous, something that felt disturbingly close to hope. "I cannot speak for the others, Your Majesty," she said quietly, "but I did not choose to come here for the throne. I did not choose to come here at all. Whatever I see when I look at you, it was never a choice I was given the freedom to make." Something flickered across his face, unreadable in the dim light, before he spoke again, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. Perhaps that is precisely why I trust it." They stood together in silence after that, the space between them narrowing without either of them fully closing it, and Eleanor felt the weight of her secret pressing harder against her chest than it ever had before. Every day she remained silent was another day she allowed him to believe in a future she knew, with absolute certainty, she could never give him. The longer she waited, the crueler the eventual truth would become, and yet she could not bring herself to speak it. Not yet. Not while the fragile trust between them still felt so new, so easily shattered. Somewhere behind the palace walls, in the quiet corners where servants gossiped and consorts plotted, Isabel was already beginning to ask questions about the quiet girl from the debt-ridden province. Questions that would, in time, prove far more dangerous than Eleanor could yet imagine. Autumn arrived slowly in the capital, turning the palace gardens shades of amber and rust, and with the changing season came a change in the way the court watched Eleanor. What had once been idle gossip about the debt-ridden newcomer had hardened into something more calculated. She was summoned by the emperor more often than any consort in recent memory, and the entire wing knew it. Mistress Odile pulled her aside one morning, her sharp eyes softer than usual, though the warning in her voice remained clear. "You are being watched closely now," she said. "Favor draws eyes the way blood draws hounds. Be careful what you say, and be careful who hears it." Eleanor nodded, though she already understood the danger better than Odile perhaps realized. It was not only her words she needed to guard. It was everything beneath them, the truth she had carried since childhood, growing heavier with every week that passed in silence. Her friendship with Charlotte deepened during this time, becoming one of the few genuine comforts in a place built almost entirely on performance. They took to walking together in the early mornings, before the rest of the wing had risen, sharing quiet conversation away from listening ears. "You care for him," Charlotte said one such morning, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. "I have watched you long enough to see it." Eleanor did not deny it. There seemed little point, not with Charlotte, who had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival. "I do," she admitted, "more than I expected to, more than is wise, given everything." "Given what?" Charlotte asked gently. Eleanor hesitated, the words rising in her throat before she forced them back down. She trusted Charlotte more than anyone else in the palace, but trust and safety were not the same thing, and she had learned that lesson too well from her father to forget it now. "Given that I am the daughter of a desperate man," she said instead, choosing a truth that was real, even if it was not the whole truth. "Given that I never expected to matter to anyone here beyond the debt I represent." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, something knowing in her expression, as though she sensed there was more beneath the surface of Eleanor's words. But she did not press further, only reached out and squeezed Eleanor's hand briefly before they continued their walk in comfortable silence. Julian's attention, meanwhile, showed no sign of waning. Their conversations grew longer, ranging from matters of state to smaller, more personal exchanges that Eleanor found herself treasuring despite every instinct warning her not to. He told her, one evening, about his mother, who had died when he was young, and the loneliness that had followed him through a childhood spent mostly among advisors and tutors rather than family. She told him, in turn, about her own mother's quiet grief over a marriage that had long since curdled into obligation, and the way she had learned early to keep her own feelings hidden rather than risk becoming another burden in an already burdened household. "We are not so different," Julian observed one night, as they sat together in his study, a pot of tea cooling untouched between them. Two people raised to expect very little warmth, surprised now to find it where we least anticipated. "Is that what this is, Your Majesty?" Eleanor asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Warmth?" He met her eyes steadily. "I believe it is becoming exactly that. Does it frighten you?" "Yes," she admitted, because lying to him, even about something so small, felt suddenly impossible. "It frightens me greatly." He did not press for an explanation, and she was grateful for his restraint, though guilt gnawed at her all the same. Every gentle exchange between them felt like a debt accumulating, one she knew she would eventually have to repay with a truth that could unravel everything they had built. The imperial physicians began making their presence known around this time, a fact that Eleanor noticed with growing unease. She was summoned, along with several other consorts, for what was described only as a routine health assessment, though the questions asked by the stern-faced physician left little doubt about their true purpose. "Have you experienced any irregularities in your cycle since arriving at the palace?" the physician asked, his tone clinical, his eyes not once lifting from the scroll where he recorded her answers. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "No irregularities, no," she said carefully, which was, in its own way, true. There was nothing irregular about a body that had simply stopped functioning the way it was meant to, 6 years ago, in the wake of a fever that had nearly taken her life entirely. "Any history of illness in childhood, fevers particularly?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Eleanor forced herself to keep her expression neutral, even as her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "A mild fever, as a child. Nothing unusual. Most children in my province suffered similar illnesses during that season." The physician made a note without further comment, and Eleanor left the examination room with her hands trembling, though she kept them folded carefully in her sleeves where no one could see. She had lied, not outright, but by omission, by choosing her words with the same careful precision she used in every other conversation within these walls. It would not hold forever. She knew that, even as she walked away, the weight of her secret pressing harder against her chest with every step. That evening, Isabel cornered her near the entrance to the consort wing, her expression sharp with barely concealed satisfaction. "I hear the physicians visited today," she said. "How fortunate for you that you have nothing to hide." Eleanor kept her face carefully composed. "I am not sure what you mean, Isabel." "Of course you don't." Isabel's smile did not reach her eyes. "But you should know, favorite of the moment, that I have friends among the palace staff who remember things others might prefer forgotten. Your province is smaller than you think, Eleanor Whitmore. Word travels, even from there, if one knows who to ask." The threat was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt genuine fear settle into her stomach for the first time since her arrival at the palace. Isabel was not simply cruel out of jealousy. She was searching, actively, for something to use, and Eleanor had no way of knowing how close she had already come to the truth. She sought out Julian that same night, finding him in the garden as she often did, though this time her presence carried a weight she could not fully hide. He noticed immediately, setting aside whatever thoughts had occupied him and turning his full attention toward her. "Something troubles you," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor considered, for one aching moment, telling him everything. The words rose in her throat, ready to spill free. The illness, the healer, the years of carrying a secret that had only grown heavier with time. But fear held her back, fear of losing this fragile thing they had built together, fear of watching the warmth in his eyes turn to disappointment, or worse, to the same cold calculation her father had shown her the morning he sent her away. "I am simply tired, Your Majesty," she said instead, hating the lie even as she spoke it. The physician's visit was longer than expected today. Julian studied her for a long moment, and she wondered if he could see through the lie entirely, if the careful mask she had built over the years was as transparent to him as glass. But he only nodded, accepting her explanation with a gentleness that made the guilt inside her burn even hotter. "Rest then," he said softly. "Whatever burdens you carry, Eleanor, know that you do not have to carry them entirely alone. Not here, not with me." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve entirely, and she left the garden that night with tears she refused to let fall until she was safely behind the closed door of her own chamber. She thought of her father's parting words, his reminder of what her silence was worth to their family, and for the first time she felt real hatred toward him, sharp and unrelenting, for placing her in a position where every kindness she received felt like another brick added to a wall of deception she had never wanted to build in the first place. Somewhere else in the palace that same night, Isabel sat with a servant girl who had once worked in the kitchens of a minor estate not far from Eleanor's childhood home, listening carefully as the girl recounted, in exchange for a handful of silver coins, everything she remembered about a fever that had swept through the province 6 years ago, and the strange, sad rumors that had followed a certain lord's daughter ever since. Winter settled over the capital with a sharp, biting cold that drove most of the court indoors. But Isabel's search for answers did not slow with the season. She moved carefully, patiently, gathering fragments of information the way a spider gathers threads, each one useless alone, but dangerous when woven together with the rest. The servant girl's story had given her a name, the village healer, Agnes, who still lived in Eleanor's home province, and who, according to rumor, had once spoken words over a sick child's bed that no one in the household was ever supposed to repeat. Isabel could not travel there herself, not without drawing suspicion, but she had gold, and gold, she had learned, traveled far more easily than she ever could. She sent a trusted servant, a quiet man named Edmund who had served her family for years and asked no questions in exchange for steady payment, on the long journey to Eleanor's home province with instructions to find the healer and learn whatever she knew. While Isabel's plan unfolded in the shadows, life within the palace continued its delicate dance. Eleanor's bond with Julian deepened further, each conversation another thread woven between them, though the guilt she carried grew heavier with every passing week. She began to notice, with growing unease, that the other consorts had started treating her differently, not with the open hostility Isabel displayed, but with a wary respect that suggested even they understood something had shifted, something that placed Eleanor closer to the Emperor's favor than any of them had managed in years. "He has never spoken so openly with anyone," Charlotte told her one evening as they sat together in Eleanor's small chamber, a rare comfort in the otherwise formal atmosphere of the palace. "Not even with his most trusted advisors. The staff talk of nothing else." "I wish they wouldn't," Eleanor admitted. "Attention like that feels dangerous." "It is dangerous," Charlotte agreed gently. "But so is pretending you feel nothing, when clearly you do. Eleanor, whatever you're hiding, and I do believe you're hiding something, it will not stay hidden forever. Not in a place like this." Eleanor's breath caught, but Charlotte's expression held no accusation, only quiet concern. "What makes you think I'm hiding anything?" Eleanor asked carefully. "Because I have watched you flinch every time the physicians are mentioned," Charlotte said. "Because you speak of your future here with a kind of sorrow that doesn't match a woman falling in love with an emperor who clearly returns her feelings. I don't know what it is, and I won't ask you to tell me if you're not ready. But I would rather you trust me with it than let Isabel discover it first, in whatever way she's determined to." The warning settled cold in Eleanor's stomach. She had not realized her fear was so visible that the mask she worked so hard to maintain had cracks Charlotte, at least, could see clearly. She considered, once again, confiding the truth, but old habits of silence held firm, reinforced by years of learning that secrets, once spoken aloud, could never be called back. "Thank you," she said instead, quietly, "for caring enough to notice." Charlotte squeezed her hand and said nothing further, though the concern in her eyes lingered long after she left the room. Julian summoned Eleanor to his private study 3 days later, and she arrived expecting another evening of quiet conversation, tea, and the easy companionship that had become the most treasured part of her days within the palace walls. Instead, she found him standing near the window, his posture rigid, a folded letter held tightly in one hand. "Your Majesty?" she asked, uncertain, sensing immediately that something had shifted. Julian turned to face her, and for the first time since their initial meeting, she saw something in his expression that made her stomach twist with dread. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to confusion, tinged with hurt. "My chief advisor received an interesting report today," he said slowly, "concerning a healer in your home province, and a fever you suffered as a child." Eleanor felt the room tilt beneath her feet. The moment she had feared for weeks, months even, had finally arrived, and despite every rehearsal she had run through in her mind, she found herself utterly unprepared for the reality of it. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice barely steady, "I can explain." "Then explain," Julian said, his tone carefully controlled, though she could hear the effort it took him to keep it that way. "Tell me it is not true. Tell me the healer who tended you during that fever did not tell your mother, in front of at least one servant who apparently still remembers it clearly enough to sell the story for coin, that the illness had left you unable to bear children." The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt something inside her collapse entirely. The careful walls she had built over years finally crumbling under the weight of a truth she could no longer deny. "It's true," she whispered. "All of it. I have known since I was 12 years old that I cannot conceive." Julian's expression did not change immediately, though something in his posture stiffened further, as though he were bracing himself against a blow he had not fully expected, despite the warning in the report he held. "And you said nothing," he said quietly. "Not when you arrived here. Not in any of the weeks since. Weeks I spent believing there was honesty between us, at least." "I was afraid," Eleanor said, tears finally slipping free despite her efforts to hold them back. "My father knew. He knew when he offered me to your court, and he told me, before I even left our home, that my silence was worth more to our family than the truth. I did not choose this arrangement, Your Majesty. I did not choose to deceive you. I only chose, foolishly, to stay silent rather than risk everything the moment I arrived. You had weeks, Julian said, his voice sharper now, though still controlled in the way of a man unwilling to fully lose his composure, even in anger. Weeks in which you could have told me the truth privately, before it became a matter for advisors and reports and whispered rumors throughout my own court. Instead, I learn of it secondhand, from a document delivered by a woman I suspect has her own reasons for wanting you gone. Eleanor flinched at the accusation, though she could not fully deny the truth in it. I know how it looks, she said. I know I should have told you sooner. But every day that passed, I convinced myself there would be a better moment, a safer moment, and there never was one. I was a coward, Your Majesty. I understand if you cannot forgive that. Julian was silent for a long moment, staring at the letter in his hand, as though it might offer some answer neither of them could find on their own. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by something wearier, more uncertain. I do not yet know what I feel, he admitted. I trusted you, Eleanor, more than I have trusted anyone in years. Learning that trust was built on a foundation you knew was false from the very beginning. That is not something I can simply set aside because your reasons for silence were understandable. I know, Eleanor said softly. You will remain in the consort wing for now, Julian said, his tone shifting back toward formal distance, a wall rising between them that had not existed just moments before. I must consider what this means, both for the succession and for whatever remained between us. I ask that you speak of this to no one until I have decided how the matter will be handled. Eleanor bowed, her entire body trembling with grief and shame in equal measure. As you command, Your Majesty. She left his study with her composure barely intact, making it only as far as the empty corridor outside before the tears she had held back finally overwhelmed her entirely. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall and slid down until she sat crumpled on the floor, the weight of months of careful silence finally, catastrophically, undone. Somewhere in the palace, Isabel received word that her plan had succeeded exactly as intended and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a small, satisfied smile. News of the discovery spread through the palace faster than Eleanor could have imagined possible, despite Julian's explicit order for silence. By the following morning, servants whispered about it in the corridors, and the other consorts eyed her with expressions ranging from pity to open triumph. Isabel, in particular, seemed to glow with a satisfaction she made no real effort to hide, though she offered no direct confrontation, content instead to let the consequences unfold on their own. Charlotte was the only one who sought Eleanor out, finding her in the garden where she had retreated to escape the weight of so many watching eyes. I heard, Charlotte said simply, sitting beside her on the cold stone bench, without waiting for an invitation. Is it true? Eleanor nodded, unable to summon the strength for anything more elaborate. All of it, she said. I should have told you when you asked. I should have told him the very first day I arrived. Perhaps, Charlotte said gently. Or perhaps you were simply a frightened young woman, placed in an impossible situation by a father who cared more for his debts than his daughter's well-being. I do not judge you for your silence, Eleanor. I only wish you had trusted someone with the truth sooner, if only so you would not have carried it entirely alone. Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to lean into her friend's steady presence, grateful beyond words for the absence of judgment in Charlotte's voice. What happens now? She asked, more to herself than to Charlotte, though she hoped for an answer all the same. That depends on him, Charlotte said quietly, and on how much of what grew between you was real, rather than built entirely on the lie you were forced to maintain. Eleanor spent the following days in a kind of suspended dread, summoned nowhere, spoken to by almost no one beyond the necessary formalities of daily palace life. She caught glimpses of Julian occasionally, across courtyards or through open doorways, but he made no move to seek her out, and she lacked the courage to approach him uninvited after everything that had already passed between them. It was during this uncertain silence that word arrived of her father's summons to the capital. Lord Edgar Whitmore had been called before the Emperor's court to answer for the deception he had orchestrated, and Eleanor felt a sick twist of dread at the news, uncertain whether she feared more for her father's fate or for what his presence might mean for whatever remained of her own standing within the palace. He arrived 3 days later, looking smaller than Eleanor remembered him. His usual bluster faded into something closer to genuine fear as he was led through the palace corridors toward the throne room where Julian awaited him. Eleanor was summoned as well, though she was given no indication of what role she might be expected to play in the proceedings. The throne room felt colder than she remembered it, the braziers along the walls burning lower than usual, casting long shadows across the black stone floor. Julian sat upon his throne with an expression carved from granite, betraying nothing of the man Eleanor had come to know in the quiet hours of their private conversations. Beside the throne stood his chief advisor, a stern older man named Nathaniel, holding the same folded report that had upended Eleanor's world days earlier. "Lord Edgar Whitmore," Julian said, his voice carrying easily across the vast room, cold and formal in a way that made Eleanor's chest ache, with the memory of gentler tones meant only for her. "You stand accused of offering your daughter to my court under false pretenses, withholding information about her health that directly concerns the succession of this empire. How do you answer?" Eleanor's father, to his credit, did not immediately grovel, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear clearly enough. "Your Majesty, I offer no excuse beyond the truth of my desperation. My family's lands faced ruin. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that my daughter's beauty and bearing would be enough to secure this alliance, regardless of whatever old rumors surrounded her childhood illness. I did not think the matter would come to light, and I confess that was a poor and selfish gamble on my part. A gamble made with your daughter's future, and with the future of my empire," Julian said, his voice sharpening. "You risked the succession itself for the sake of clearing your debts. Do you understand the gravity of what you have done?" "I do, Your Majesty," her father said, bowing lower still. "I ask only that, whatever punishment you see fit, be directed at me alone, and not at my daughter, who bears no fault in this. Beyond obeying a father's command, she had no power to refuse." Eleanor felt an unexpected swell of something complicated at those words, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the first flicker of understanding that her father, whatever his failures, had not entirely abandoned every trace of conscience in his desperation. Julian was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting briefly toward Eleanor before returning to her father with renewed severity. "You will forfeit your title and your remaining lands to the crown," he said finally. "Your debts will be settled through the sale of what remains, and you will retire to whatever modest holding is left once the accounts are cleared. You will never again hold rank within this court, nor will you attempt to leverage your daughter's position for any future gain. Should you violate these terms in any way, the punishment will fall far heavier than the loss of a title. Do you understand?" "I understand, Your Majesty," her father said, visibly relieved despite the severity of the sentence, likely aware that far worse fates could have awaited him for deceiving the throne so directly. "Leave my court," Julian said, "and do not return unless summoned." Her father was led away by the guards, and for a brief moment, before he disappeared through the towering doors, he glanced back at Eleanor with an expression she had never seen from him before, something that might have been regret, or perhaps simply the recognition of everything his choices had cost them both. She did not know if she would ever see him again, and to her own surprise, she found the uncertainty did not trouble her nearly as much as she once might have expected. The throne room emptied slowly after her father's departure, advisors and guards filing out until only Eleanor and Julian remained, along with the heavy silence that had settled between them since the truth first came to light. "You did not have to defend me," Eleanor said quietly, breaking the silence first. I expected you to hold me equally responsible. Julian descended the steps from his throne, moving toward her with the same slow deliberation she remembered from their very first meeting, though now his expression carried none of the curiosity that had defined it then, replaced instead by something far more guarded. I have spent the last several days considering exactly how responsible you are, he said, and I have concluded that a young woman ordered by her father to remain silent, under threat of consequences to her entire family, bears a different weight of blame than the man who orchestrated the entire deception from the very beginning. Then you forgive me? Eleanor asked, hope rising cautiously in her chest despite everything. I did not say that, Julian replied, and the hope withered as quickly as it had risen. Understanding the reasons behind a lie does not erase the lie itself, Eleanor. I trusted you. I told you things I have told no one else within these walls, believing that trust ran both directions between us. Learning that it did not, regardless of the reasons, has left something broken that I do not yet know how to repair, if it can be repaired at all. Eleanor nodded slowly, forcing herself to accept the truth in his words, even as it ached in her chest like an open wound. What happens to me now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally answered. That, he said quietly, is a question I have not yet finished deciding. He turned and walked away without further explanation, leaving Eleanor alone in the vast, echoing throne room, uncertain whether the future ahead of her held any place at all within these palace walls she had, despite everything, begun to think of as home. The weeks that followed her father's departure from the capital were the loneliest Eleanor had experienced since arriving at the palace. She remained in the consort wing, technically still a member of the emperor's household, but summoned nowhere, spoken to rarely, treated by most of the staff with the careful distance reserved for someone whose fate had not yet been decided. Isabel, emboldened by the success of her scheme, grew bolder in her cruelty, no longer bothering to disguise her satisfaction behind polite words. I told you his attention was a river, she said one afternoon, finding Eleanor alone in the library, one of the few quiet corners of the palace where she had taken to spending her empty hours. Rivers move on. Yours has clearly moved on from you. If you have come only to gloat, Isabel, I would prefer to be left alone, Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady, despite the ache in her chest. I have come to offer a small kindness, actually, Isabel said, settling into a nearby chair uninvited. You should know that His Majesty has begun reviewing new candidates for the consort wing, daughters of generals, this time women of proper standing who will not need to hide childhood illnesses behind a healer's silence. Perhaps it would be wise for you to consider your own departure before he formally arranges it for you. Eleanor's stomach twisted at the news, though she refused to let Isabel see how deeply it had struck her. Thank you for your concern, she said flatly, gathering the book she had been reading and rising to leave. I will consider it. She did not confront Julian directly about the rumor, though it consumed her thoughts for days afterward. Instead, she threw herself into whatever small tasks the palace offered her, assisting Mistress Odile with the training of newer arrivals, spending long hours with Charlotte, discussing everything except the subject weighing most heavily on both their minds. It was Charlotte, in fact, who eventually raised the matter directly, cornering Eleanor in the garden on a particularly cold afternoon. You cannot simply wait here in silence forever, hoping he changes his mind on his own, Charlotte said. If you love him, and I believe you do, you owe it to yourself to speak with him plainly, rather than allow rumors and Isabel's poison to decide your fate for you. And if he has already decided, Eleanor asked. If speaking with him only forces him to say aloud what he has clearly already concluded, then at least you will know, Charlotte said gently. Uncertainty is its own kind of cruelty, Eleanor. You deserve better than to simply wait here, wondering, while the court makes your decisions for you. Eleanor considered her friend's words carefully over the following days, gathering her courage slowly, the way one gathers strength before a difficult climb. She requested an audience through the proper channels, uncertain whether Julian would even grant it, and was surprised when word came back within the day that he would see her that evening, in his private study. She arrived with her heart pounding, uncertain what she intended to say, only certain that Charlotte was right, that continued silence would serve no one, least of all herself. Julian was waiting when she entered, standing near the window as he so often did, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told her nothing of his thoughts. "You requested this audience," he said, without preamble. "I confess I was uncertain whether you would." "I have heard rumors, Your Majesty," Eleanor said, choosing directness over the careful diplomacy she might once have relied on, "that you are reviewing new candidates for the consort wing. I would rather hear the truth from you than continue guessing at my own fate through the whispers of others." Julian's expression tightened slightly, though whether from anger or discomfort, she could not tell. "The rumors are not entirely false," he admitted. "My advisors have pressed the matter of succession with increasing urgency since the truth of your condition became known throughout the court. They believe, and perhaps rightly so, that the Empire cannot afford further delay in securing an heir." Eleanor forced herself to remain steady despite the pain those words caused. "Then you intend to choose another consort, one capable of giving you the child I cannot." "I have not yet decided what I intend," Julian said, his voice tightening with something that sounded almost like frustration, though not directed at her. "My advisors believe the decision is simple, a matter of practical necessity that leaves little room for sentiment. They are not entirely wrong, from the perspective of the Empire's stability, but they are not the ones who spent months learning to trust a woman whose company brought more genuine peace than I have known since childhood." Eleanor's breath caught at the admission, hope flaring despite her best efforts to guard against it. "Then what do you believe, Your Majesty?" she asked softly. "Beyond what your advisors tell you is necessary." Julian was silent for a long moment, crossing the room slowly until he stood close enough that she could see the genuine conflict written across his features, a struggle between duty and something far more personal that he had clearly been wrestling with in private for weeks. "I believe," he said finally, "that I have spent every day since learning the truth trying to convince myself that choosing another woman would be the wiser path, the path expected of an emperor concerned first and foremost with securing his bloodline, and I have failed, every single time, to make myself believe it." "Why?" Eleanor whispered. "Because the Empire does not need only an heir," Julian said. "It needs a ruler capable of governing wisely, and I have found no counsel more valuable in these recent months than yours, offered honestly, even when honesty was difficult to hear. An heir secures the future in blood alone. A partner capable of true counsel secures it in wisdom as well. I am no longer certain the first matters more than the second, whatever tradition and my advisors might insist." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she made no effort to hide this time. "Then why have you kept your distance these past weeks?" she asked. "Why leave me to wonder, when you felt this all along?" "Because trust, once broken, does not repair itself simply because feelings remain unchanged," Julian said, his voice softer now, though the honesty in it cut just as deeply. "I needed time to understand whether what I felt for you was strong enough to survive the truth of your deception, or whether it was built on an illusion I had simply been too foolish to question." "And what have you concluded?" Eleanor asked, barely daring to breathe as she waited for his answer. Julian reached out, gently, and brushed a tear from her cheek with a tenderness that undid the last of her composure entirely. "I have concluded," he said quietly, "that I would rather spend my life navigating the complicated truth of loving you than settle for the simple comfort of a lie with anyone else." The words broke something open inside her, relief and joy tangled so tightly with lingering grief that she could not fully separate one feeling from the other. But beneath it all, for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that whatever future awaited her within these palace walls, she would not have to face it entirely alone. Yet even as the warmth of the moment settled between them, Eleanor knew the empire's advisors would not simply accept Julian's private feelings as sufficient reason to abandon the matter of succession entirely. Somewhere beyond the walls of this quiet study, a far larger battle over the future of the throne was only just beginning to take shape. News of the renewed closeness between Eleanor and Julian spread through the palace within days, and with it came a shift in the court's mood that Eleanor could feel in every corridor she walked. The advisors, led by the stern Nathaniel, requested a formal audience with the emperor barely a week later, and Eleanor learned, through Charlotte's careful gathering of palace gossip, that the meeting had grown heated enough to be heard through the study's heavy doors. "They are frightened," Charlotte explained, sitting beside Eleanor in the garden as the last of the season's leaves fell around them. "The empire has known instability before, generations ago, when a childless emperor died without a clear successor, and the provinces nearly tore themselves apart fighting over the throne. Nathaniel remembers those stories from his own grandfather. He does not want to see them repeated." "I understand his fear," Eleanor said quietly. "I only wish it did not require my absence to resolve it." "Perhaps it doesn't," Charlotte said. "There are other paths to securing succession beyond a consort's ability to bear children directly. His Majesty has cousins, does he not? Distant branches of the imperial bloodline that could be formally recognized as heirs should the direct line prove uncertain." Eleanor had not considered this possibility, and she turned the idea over carefully in her mind throughout the following days, uncertain whether it offered genuine hope or merely another fragile possibility destined to collapse under the weight of tradition and expectation. Julian summoned her again several days later, this time not to his private study, but to a smaller council chamber, where Nathaniel and several other senior advisors waited, their expressions ranging from cautious neutrality to open disapproval. Eleanor entered with her chin lifted, refusing to let their scrutiny shake her composure, though her heart pounded uncomfortably beneath her calm exterior. "Eleanor Whitmore," Nathaniel said, his tone formal and measured. "His Majesty has informed us of his intention to retain you within the consort wing, despite the circumstances surrounding your arrival. We have gathered to discuss what this means for the matter of imperial succession." "I am listening," Eleanor said simply. Nathaniel exchanged a brief glance with Julian before continuing. "There exists precedent within our history for an emperor to formally recognize an heir from outside the direct bloodline of his consorts, provided the individual in question carries sufficient imperial blood through a collateral branch of the family. His Majesty has a cousin, the son of his late uncle, currently serving as governor of the northern provinces. He is unmarried, capable, and by all accounts a competent administrator who has earned the respect of those under his governance." Eleanor listened carefully, understanding slowly where this line of reasoning intended to lead. "You are suggesting His Majesty name this cousin as his formal heir, rather than continue seeking a child through the consort wing." "It is one possibility among several," Nathaniel said carefully. "Though I confess, it is the one I find most likely to satisfy both the Empire's need for stability and His Majesty's evident wishes regarding your continued place within his household." Julian, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "I have considered this path carefully in recent days," he said. "My cousin has proven himself capable in every measure that matters for governance. Formally recognizing him as heir would resolve the succession crisis without requiring me to abandon what I have found here, within these walls, with Eleanor." One of the older advisors, a stiff-postured woman named Beatrice, who had served 3 emperors before Julian, spoke up with visible reluctance. "Your Majesty, I do not question the wisdom of your affection, nor the sincerity of Lady Eleanor's character, which has proven itself admirably despite the circumstances of her arrival. But I must ask whether the court, and more importantly the provinces themselves, will accept a cousin's claim over that of a direct heir, however capable he may prove to be. Tradition carries weight that cannot simply be legislated away by council decree. Tradition has also nearly destroyed this empire before. when rigid adherence to bloodline left the throne empty and the provinces at war with one another, Julian countered, his voice firm with a conviction Eleanor had not heard from him before. I would rather secure a stable and capable successor through recognized precedent than gamble the empire's future on the uncertain hope of a child that may never come, whether through Eleanor or any consort chosen in her place. The chamber fell into tense silence following his declaration, the advisors clearly divided on the matter, though none seemed prepared to openly challenge the emperor's stated intention. Eleanor watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and lingering guilt, aware that whatever path forward emerged from this discussion, it existed only because of the complications her presence had introduced into what should have been a straightforward matter of succession. I would ask one thing of this council, Eleanor said, finally breaking her silence, drawing surprised glances from several of the advisors who had clearly not expected her to speak uninvited. If His Majesty's cousin is to be considered as heir, let the decision be made on the merits of his character and capability alone, not as a hurried solution forced by circumstances surrounding me. The empire deserves a successor, chosen with the same care that would be given to any child born of the direct line, not one selected in haste merely to resolve an inconvenience. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his previously guarded expression. A wise consideration, he said finally, and one that speaks well of your understanding of the empire's true needs, beyond your own circumstances. Then let us proceed with proper deliberation, Julian said, rising from his seat with an air of finality. I will summon my cousin to the capital, that we might assess his suitability directly, rather than relying solely on reports from distant provinces. Until such deliberations are complete, matters of succession will remain formally unresolved, and I ask this council's patience in the meantime. The advisors filed out slowly, some clearly satisfied with the compromise, others still visibly uneasy, though none openly contested the emperor's decision. Eleanor remained behind as the chamber emptied, and when only she and Julian remained, he crossed the room and took her hands in his, a gesture of open affection he had rarely allowed himself in the presence of others. You handled yourself well, he said softly. Better than I expected, given the circumstances. I meant every word, Eleanor said. Whatever comes of this, I would not want your cousin's future, or the empire's, decided carelessly, simply for my sake. Julian studied her with an expression of genuine admiration, something that made her chest warm despite the uncertainty still hanging over both their futures. This is precisely why I could not simply let you go, Eleanor, whatever tradition or expectation demanded of me. You think of the empire's well-being even now, when it would be far easier to think only of your own. Eleanor smiled, though the expression carried a weight of exhaustion beneath it. Perhaps I have simply learned, through everything that has happened these past months, that the easiest path is rarely the wisest one. Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a palace guard, breathless and clearly troubled, who bowed hastily before delivering his message. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. There has been an incident in the consort wing. Lady Isabel has been discovered attempting to bribe a member of the kitchen staff to poison Lady Eleanor's evening meal. The staff member reported the attempt immediately, and Isabel has been detained by the palace guard pending Your Majesty's judgment. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, the guard's words landing with the force of a physical blow. Julian's expression hardened instantly, all traces of the earlier warmth replaced by something far colder and more dangerous. Bring her to the throne room, Julian said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I will address this matter myself, immediately. The throne room, so often a place of quiet formality during Eleanor's visits, felt entirely different when she entered it that evening, tension thick in the air as guards led Isabel forward to stand before the throne. Isabel's usual composure had cracked considerably, her eyes wide with fear beneath a thin veneer of defiance she was struggling to maintain. Your Majesty, Isabel began, her voice trembling despite her attempt at steadiness. I can explain. You will have the opportunity to speak, Julian said, his voice carrying a coldness Eleanor had never heard from him before, not even during the darkest moments following the discovery of her own secret. But first, I will hear the account of the kitchen staff member who reported this scheme. A young man, clearly nervous at finding himself the center of such serious attention, stepped forward and bowed deeply before speaking. Your Majesty, Lady Isabel approached me 3 days ago, offering payment in exchange for adding a substance to Lady Eleanor's evening meal, one she claimed would cause illness severe enough to force her departure from the palace, though she assured me it would not prove fatal. I refused, and reported the matter to the head of the kitchens immediately, though I confess I delayed coming forward out of fear of Lady Isabel's influence within the court. Julian's jaw tightened visibly as he absorbed the account, his gaze shifting to Isabel with an intensity that made even Eleanor, standing several feet away, feel a chill run through her. Is this account accurate, Isabel? He asked, his voice deceptively quiet. Isabel's composure finally shattered entirely, tears spilling down her face as she sank to her knees before the throne. Your Majesty, please, I never intended real harm. I only wanted her gone, wanted my own position restored, the position I earned through 2 years of loyal service before she arrived and stole every ounce of your attention. I was desperate, Your Majesty, desperate in a way I never expected to become. Desperation does not excuse an attempt to poison another woman within my own household, Julian said, his voice hardening further. You have spent weeks gathering information meant to destroy Eleanor's standing here, and when that scheme succeeded beyond even your own hopes, you turned to methods that could have caused genuine harm, regardless of your claims that you intended nothing fatal. This is not the behavior of a woman deserving of continued place within my court. Your Majesty, I beg your mercy, Isabel sobbed, her earlier defiance completely dissolved into genuine terror. Eleanor watched the scene unfold with a complicated tangle of emotions, anger at the danger she had narrowly avoided, tangled uncomfortably with something like pity for a woman who had clearly let jealousy and fear consume every better instinct she might once have possessed. She stepped forward, unable to remain silent despite the impropriety of speaking uninvited before the throne. Your Majesty, she said, drawing surprised glances from everyone in the room, including Julian himself. May I speak? Julian's expression softened slightly as he turned toward her, though the anger in his eyes remained banked just beneath the surface. You may. I do not ask that Isabel's actions go unpunished, Eleanor said carefully. What she attempted was dangerous and deserves serious consequence. But I would ask that whatever punishment is decided, it not be one that destroys her entirely. I understand, perhaps better than most in this room, what it feels like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control, to make choices out of fear rather than genuine malice. I do not believe Isabel is evil, Your Majesty. I believe she is frightened, and her fear led her somewhere dangerous. Isabel looked up at Eleanor with an expression of pure astonishment, clearly not expecting mercy from the very woman she had tried to harm. Julian studied Eleanor for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his features despite the gravity of the situation. Your compassion does you credit, he said finally, though it does not erase the danger of what was attempted. He turned back to Isabel, his expression firming once more into formal judgment. Isabel, you will be stripped of your position within the consort wing and return to your family's household in disgrace. You will not be permitted to return to the capital, nor to seek position within any noble household, for a period of no less than 5 years. Consider this mercy, granted only because Lady Eleanor has spoken on your behalf. Had she not done so, the consequences you faced would have been considerably more severe. Isabel bowed her head, tears still falling freely, though something in her posture suggested genuine relief at the leniency of her sentence, compared to what she had clearly feared. Thank you, Your Majesty, she whispered, and thank you, Lady Eleanor. I do not deserve your kindness, but I am grateful for it nonetheless. She was led from the throne room by the guards, her disgrace complete, but her life and future, however diminished, still intact. Eleanor watched her go with a quiet sense of closure, understanding that, whatever danger Isabel had once represented, it had finally, definitively, come to an end. The throne room emptied gradually until only Julian and Eleanor remained, the tension of the evening's events still hanging heavily in the air between them. Julian crossed the distance to stand before her, his expression softening from the hard formality of judgment back into something warmer, more personal. "You continue to surprise me," he said quietly. "Most in your position would have demanded the harshest punishment possible for a woman who tried to poison them. Most in my position have not spent months learning what it feels like to be judged unfairly for circumstances beyond their control," Eleanor said. "I could not, in good conscience, ask for cruelty toward someone whose fear, however dangerously expressed, was not so different from my own." Julian reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "The council will meet with my cousin within the week," he said softly. "Once the matter of succession is settled, I intend to formally announce your place within this court, Eleanor, not merely as a consort held in uncertain favor, but as someone whose counsel and character I have come to value beyond measure." Eleanor's heart swelled with a hope she had not allowed herself to feel fully since the day her secret first came to light. "And if your cousin proves unsuitable?" she asked, unable to fully release the caution that had protected her through so many months of uncertainty. "Then we will find another path," Julian said simply. "But I no longer believe, Eleanor, that any path forward exists which does not include you standing beside me. Whatever solution the Empire requires for its succession, I have made my choice regarding my own heart, and I do not intend to reconsider it." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, bitter winter, and for the first time since her father's knock at dawn had upended her life entirely, Eleanor allowed herself to believe fully in a future she had once thought impossible to claim as her own. The cousin arrived at the capital 11 days later, and Eleanor found herself watching his arrival from a distance, curious but careful to keep her distance from a process that, however much it might shape her own future, was not truly hers to influence directly. His name was Alistair, a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with a quiet, thoughtful bearing that reminded Eleanor faintly of Julian himself, though without the same weight of imperial authority pressing down on his shoulders. Charlotte, ever resourceful in gathering palace news, brought Eleanor updates over the following days as the council conducted its evaluation. "They say he governs the northern provinces with remarkable fairness," Charlotte reported, settling into her usual spot beside Eleanor in the garden. "The harvest taxes there have been lower than anywhere else in the empire these past 3 years, yet the province remains among the most prosperous. He is well liked by those he governs, from what the messengers say." "That is promising," Eleanor said, feeling a cautious optimism she had not expected to allow herself. "There is more," Charlotte continued, a hint of amusement in her voice. "It seems Alistair has expressed no particular ambition for the throne itself. When Nathaniel first informed him of the council's consideration, he reportedly asked whether the position came with fewer obligations than his current governorship, rather than expressing any eagerness for greater power." Eleanor laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness after so many weeks of tension. A reluctant air. Perhaps that is exactly what the Empire needs, someone who values the responsibility over the glory of the title. The council's deliberations continued for nearly 2 weeks, during which time Eleanor was summoned only once, to a smaller gathering where Alistair himself requested to meet her directly, a request that surprised her given the informal nature of her own position within the unfolding matter of succession. They met in one of the palace's quieter reception rooms, away from the formal scrutiny of the full council. Alistair greeted her with a respectful bow, his expression open and curious rather than guarded. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "I confess I wish to meet the woman whose circumstances have brought me so unexpectedly to the capital." "I am sorry for the disruption this has caused to your life, Governor Alistair," Eleanor said sincerely. I never intended for my presence here to reshape the Empire's entire line of succession. Do not apologize, Alistair said, waving off her concern with an easy smile. I have governed the northern provinces for nearly 6 years now, and I confess, a part of me has grown weary of the isolation such a role demands. If the council determines I am suited to serve as heir, I will accept the responsibility with the same seriousness I have brought to my current position, but I do not resent the circumstances that brought this opportunity to my attention, whatever their unusual nature. Eleanor studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the ambition or resentment she had half expected to find, but finding instead only a calm, steady sincerity that reminded her, once again, of Julian's own character beneath the formal weight of his crown. His Majesty speaks highly of your governance, Eleanor said. I believe the Empire would be fortunate to have you as heir, should the Council reach that conclusion. And I believe, Alistair said thoughtfully, that His Majesty is fortunate to have found someone who speaks so plainly and honestly, even in matters as delicate as this one. I have heard whispers of the circumstances surrounding your arrival at court, Lady Eleanor. I confess I expected, before meeting you, to find someone far more guarded, given everything you have endured. Instead, I find a woman remarkably at peace with a difficult truth. Peace took time to find, Eleanor admitted. But I would not trade the honesty I have finally embraced for the safety of continued silence, whatever difficulties that honesty brought with it. Their conversation continued for some time, covering matters of governance, the northern provinces, and the broader concerns of an empire navigating an uncertain path toward stability. By the time Alistair took his leave, Eleanor felt a genuine warmth toward the man who might soon become heir to the throne. A warmth built on mutual respect, rather than the political calculation that so often defined relationships within these palace walls. The council reached its final decision 3 days later, and Julian summoned the full court to the throne room to hear the formal announcement. Eleanor stood among the gathered nobles and advisors, her heart pounding with anticipation as Julian rose from his throne to address the assembled crowd. After careful deliberation, Julian announced, his voice carrying clearly across the vast chamber, this council has determined that my cousin, Alistair, governor of the northern provinces, possesses the character, wisdom, and capability necessary to serve as heir to this throne, should circumstances require succession beyond my own direct line. Effective immediately, Alistair is formally recognized as my successor, pending only the traditional period of preparation and instruction that precedes any transfer of imperial authority. A murmur swept through the assembled court, some clearly relieved at the resolution, others still visibly uncertain about the break from strict bloodline tradition. Julian continued, his gaze sweeping across the room with unmistakable authority. I understand this decision departs from the expectations many of you hold regarding succession, he said. But I have concluded, after much consideration, that an empire's true strength lies not merely in the continuation of blood, but in the wisdom and character of those who govern it. Alistair has proven himself capable of both, and I trust this council's judgment, as well as my own, that he will serve this empire well should the day come that he is called upon to lead it. The announcement, though not universally embraced, was accepted without open challenge. The weight of Julian's authority and the evident soundness of his reasoning enough to quiet whatever reservations remained among the more traditional members of the court. As the formal proceedings concluded and the assembled nobles began to disperse, Julian's gaze found Eleanor across the room, and something in his expression told her the day's announcements were not yet finished. He crossed the throne room toward her, ignoring the curious glances of the departing court, and took her hand gently in his. The matter of succession is settled, he said quietly, for her ears alone. Which means, Eleanor, that nothing stands any longer between us and the future I have wished to claim since the earliest days of your arrival here. Eleanor felt tears of relief and joy gathering in her eyes, the long months of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift, like fog burning away beneath morning sun. "What do you intend, Your Majesty?" she asked softly. though she suspected, from the warmth in his eyes, that she already knew the answer. "I intend," Julian said, "to make you my empress, not because the empire requires an heir from your body, but because I require your presence beside me for whatever years remain of my reign, and I can think of no truth I wish to declare more openly, before this entire court, than that simple fact." The announcement of Eleanor's elevation to empress spread through the capital within days, carried by messengers to every corner of the empire, from the northern provinces where Alastair continued his governorship, to the small, debt-worn estate, where Eleanor's father now lived in quiet disgrace. She wondered, sometimes, what he thought upon hearing the news, whether he felt vindication for the gamble he had made months earlier, or shame at how close his own choices had come to destroying everything before it could blossom into something real. She did not seek him out to ask. Some distances, she had come to understand, were better left uncrossed, at least for now. The preparation for her formal coronation as empress took nearly 2 months, filled with fittings for ceremonial robes, lessons on protocols she had never expected to need, and long conversations with Julian about the kind of rule they hoped to build together. Charlotte remained close throughout, her friendship one of the few constants Eleanor treasured amid the whirlwind of change reshaping her entire life. "You will need advisors of your own once the coronation is complete," Julian told her one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens, now in full bloom with the arrival of spring. "Women whose judgment you trust completely, who will speak honestly with you even when honesty is difficult." "I already know who I would choose first," Eleanor said, smiling as she thought of Charlotte's steady kindness through every trial of the past year. "Though I suspect she will protest, insisting she is not suited for such a formal role." "Let her protest," Julian said, amusement warming his voice. "The best advisors are often those who never sought the position for themselves." Their conversation drifted, as it often did in these quiet evening walks, to the matter of the empire's future, beyond the immediate concerns of coronation and ceremony. Julian spoke of reforms he hoped to enact, changes to the tax structures that burdened provinces like the one Eleanor had grown up in, protections for families facing the kind of desperate debt that had once driven her own father to such drastic measures. "I want no other family to face what mine did," Eleanor said quietly. "No other daughter offered up like a debt payment because her father saw no other path forward. Then we will build that future together," Julian said, taking her hand as they walked. "An empire is only as strong as the wisdom of those who guide it, Eleanor, and I have found no wisdom I trust more than yours." The day of the coronation arrived beneath a clear spring sky, the palace gardens bursting with color as nobles from every province gathered to witness the formal ceremony. Eleanor stood before the assembled court in robes of deep gold, her nerves steadied by the presence of Charlotte close beside her and the sight of Julian waiting at the front of the grand hall, his expression carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with the formal ceremony and everything to do with the woman walking toward him. Nathaniel, who had once viewed Eleanor with such cautious suspicion, now presided over the ceremony with visible approval, his stern features softened by an expression close to genuine pride. "Let it be known," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall, "that Eleanor Whitmore is hereby recognized as Empress of this realm, chosen not for the promise of an heir, but for the wisdom, honesty, and strength of character she has shown throughout her time within this court. May her reign, alongside that of Emperor Julian, bring stability and prosperity to every corner of this empire." As the crown was placed upon her head, Eleanor felt the weight of it settle not as a burden, but as a quiet affirmation of everything she had endured to reach this moment. She thought of the frightened young woman who had climbed into a carriage months earlier, certain her secret would eventually destroy whatever future awaited her at the palace. That woman had been wrong, not because the secret had not mattered, but because the truth, once finally spoken, had proven far stronger a foundation than the silence she had once believed necessary for survival. Julian took her hand before the assembled court, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of affection that needed no further words to convey. "The Empire has its heir secured through Alistair's steady governance," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "And it has, in Eleanor, an empress whose judgment I trust above all others. Let this day mark not merely a formal ceremony, but the beginning of a partnership built on honesty, respect, and a shared commitment to the well-being of every soul within our borders." The court erupted into applause, and Eleanor felt tears of genuine joy slip down her cheeks as Julian drew her close, the formal distance of ceremony giving way, briefly, to the simple warmth of two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly what they needed in each other. In the months that followed, Eleanor settled into her new role with a steady confidence that surprised even herself. She worked alongside Julian on reforms to protect struggling provinces from the kind of crushing debt that had once nearly destroyed her own family, and she found, in Charlotte's appointment as her closest advisor, a partnership built on the same honest friendship that had sustained her through the darkest months of her arrival at court. Word occasionally reached her of her father, living quietly now on his diminished lands, and of Isabel, who had, according to rare reports, begun rebuilding a modest life far from the capital's political intrigue. Eleanor felt no lingering resentment toward either of them, only a quiet gratitude that her own path, despite every obstacle, had led her somewhere she could finally call home. Alistair visited the capital periodically, his governance of the northern provinces continuing with the same steady competence that had earned him his position as heir, and Eleanor found in him not a rival for Julian's affection or attention, but a genuine friend whose company she came to value deeply over the following years. Late one evening, nearly a year after her coronation, Eleanor stood beside Julian in the same garden where they had first spoken honestly of their fears and hopes, watching the stars emerge over the palace's black stone towers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing me when the simpler path would have secured an heir through someone else entirely." Julian turned to her, his expression carrying the same quiet certainty she had come to rely on completely. "Not for a single moment," he said. "The Empire has stability through Alistair's steady hand, and I have found, in you, something I never expected to find within these palace walls, a partner whose honesty I trust completely, whose wisdom strengthens my own judgment, and whose presence has made this place, for the first time in my life, feel genuinely like home." Eleanor leaned into him, the weight of every fear and uncertainty that had once defined her arrival at this palace, finally settling into something peaceful, something whole. The secret that had once threatened to destroy everything had, in the end, become the very thing that led her toward a truth far more valuable than she had ever imagined possible. A truth built not on the promise of an heir, but on the simple, hard-won honesty of two people who had chosen each other, fully and completely, with nothing left hidden between them. And beneath the quiet stars of that spring evening, Eleanor understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that whatever challenges the future still held for the Empire and its people, she would face them not as a woman defined by what she could not give, but as an empress defined entirely by everything she had chosen, bravely and honestly, to become.